It comes in different flavors. We all have vitamin K1 and K2, and then there's artificial vitamin K3. K1 is, you learned that in medical school, EDTA are the fat-soluble vitamins. So they're not meant to circulate. It doesn't make much sense to measure K in the circulation. There are cofactors for a number of proteins. Best known are the coagulation factors, but also MGP, osteocalcin, cal-binding, and Gas6. The K1 is mainly in what your mother told you. Eat your vegetables. Green leafy vegetables are a great source of K1. K2 is, and I will come to this, is made by bacteria, and there's some conversion of K1 to K2, and the paradigm is that K1 is mostly in the liver, K2 is mostly working outside of the liver. So there are several epidemiologic studies on vitamin K and outcome. So the famous Rotterdam study in 4,800 elderly people said that dietary intake of menaquinone, so K2, is associated with a lower risk of coronary artery disease. Vice versa, high intake reduces coronary artery calcification, but again, an association study. And here's the same on coronary artery disease. So based on these association studies, if you go to the internet, it's all clear. Just take K2 and you have strong bones and no calcification any longer, and just buy it. So there are isoform-specific antibodies developed by Leon Schurgers from Maastricht. And here's a beautiful illustration of what he has shown. So in a normal rat, you do a bone stain, and this is the aorta. There's no bone in the aortic wall. All the matrix GLA protein is in the active gamma carboxylated state, and here you see the muscular media. And you have almost no inactive undercarboxylated matrix GLA protein. You give warfarin to these rats, and remember, this is rat poison. So you have to give them a little K1 to prevent them from bleeding to death. But you give warfarin and a little K1, you have these pronounced vascular calcification foci here. And all the MGP has shifted from the active state to the inactive state, nicely illustrating how this may relate to vascular calcification. You can also do this in mice. Thilo Krüger from our group did this some years ago, giving a little bit of K1. You have to do this to rescue the mice, because then you want to give them warfarin. And you can see how if you give increasing doses of warfarin, they have more and more aortic calcification. So the same is true in mice. Now we have a problem with our dialysis patients. This is studies from Ellen Kranenburg, where she measured, based on food questionnaires, the intake of K1 and K2. And you can see that where you and I probably take in 200 micrograms of K1 and 31 of K2, dialysis patients have a much worse intake. And this is in part because of us, because we tell them don't eat so many vegetables. That's a source of potassium. Unfortunately, it's also a source of K1. What is unclear to me, I can understand why there was a particularly low intake on hemodialysis days. Many patients simply don't eat that much on hemodialysis days, but weekends I don't understand. This is when normally patients eat. We then went on to measure this in dialysis patients, and as I said, it doesn't make much sense to measure vitamin K in the circulation. You can do it, but it's a fat-soluble vitamin. It's not meant to circulate. So we measured something called PIFCA. It's an undercarboxylated prothrombin, another vitamin K-dependent protein. And this is a much more reflective method of assessing vitamin K status. So in these 190 patients, almost 2/3 were vitamin K deficient, as indicated by these severely elevated PIVKA levels. And these up here, the top group, and note this is a log scale, this top group, they were all receiving warfarin. So warfarin in a dialysis patient, in terms of vitamin K, is a catastrophe. We also, Nadine Kesler also found something very interesting, at least in rats. She found that if she induced CKD in rats, their vitamin K recycling is impaired. So you and I recycle vitamin K all the time, and we need 3 enzymes to do so: gamma-glutamyl carboxylase, K-epoxid reductase, and quinone reductase. These 2 enzymes are inhibited by warfarin, and this is how warfarin depletes you of vitamin K. In uremia, what she found is that something reduces the activity of gamma-glutamyl carboxylase. So if that is true in our patients, they not only have the problem of low intake, because we tell them don't eat so many vegetables, they may also have an endogenous pathway which works like warfarin. And you and I all know this. A dialysis patient receiving warfarin only has 2 states. The INR is either too high or too low. They're never in target. And this may be explained by the fact that these patients are so vitamin K depleted already that it's very difficult to give them the right warfarin dose. We also found that low carboxylated matrix GLA protein levels predict mortality quite potently in hemodialysis patients. So if they had very low circulating active MGP, their survival was much worse. Now, vitamin K treatment in turn may be interesting because, for example, this reduced activity of the vitamin K recycling enzyme was actually boosted when we gave vitamin K2 to these rats. And you can see how the activity is fully restored to normal simply by giving vitamin K to these CKD rats. And there may be other effects as well. MK7 treatment, so vitamin K2 treatment of 5-6 nephrectomy rats increased aortic MGP as well. So vitamin K may act through a number of pathways of restoring vascular health in terms of calcification. And you've seen this before. I showed you this, that warfarin induces aortic calcification. Now, if you give them vitamin K2, 100 micrograms per gram, you can completely abolish the warfarin-induced calcification. And the question, of course, and this hasn't been proven in man, is whether you can create, in a way, a safe warfarin therapy by adding a little bit of K2. So, vitamin K treatment for humans, what about that? We did a pilot study some years ago where we gave 53 stable hemodialysis patients 45, 135, or 360 micrograms of K2 once daily for 6 weeks. And you can nicely see how undercarboxylated MGP and undercarboxylated osteocalcium was reduced dramatically after 6 weeks. Now, the daily recommended intake for you and me is 75 micrograms, but nobody knows. That's an estimate, because nobody knows how in this very second, how much K2 is produced by your intestinal bacteria, and they are really good in doing that. So can vitamin K supplementation reduce progression of vascular calcification in non-CKD patients? There's a first pilot study on this, where coronary artery calcification was an endpoint, and they looked after 3 years, and they gave quite a bit, 500 micrograms of K1. Remember, there's some K1 to K2 conversion, so it makes sense to give some K1. Unfortunately, there were significantly differences only after secondary analysis, restricted to patients who were more than 85% adherent with their medication. And in those, there was a lesser progression of the coronary artery calcification score, but very, very low range, and maybe this trial wasn't designed to really find differences. So the take-home from that is that K1 supplementation may slow the progression of coronary artery calcification in healthy older adults if they have pre-existing coronary artery calcification. But this wasn't really targeted to CKD patients. Now, the problem with K2 is doing the trials. And when we applied to our authorities with a trial on K2, we were told, well, you can do the trial, but once you exceed 75 micrograms, this is a drug trial. So we need GCP grade K2. At least when we wanted to start the trial, this was not available anywhere in the world. You can buy K2 bucket-wise from nutrition companies, but it's not GCP grade. So natural sources are difficult. One source is this. If you ever go to a Japanese restaurant, try to eat natto. It's a challenge eating this with chopsticks. This is like eating molten Swiss cheese with chopsticks. It pulls long strings. And in all honesty, apologies to all Japanese friends here, it tastes like rotten beans, which is what it is. It's fermented beans. So I understand half the Japanese population loves it, half doesn't. It's an ultimate source of vitamin K2, extremely rich. The other source is this, and I'm not meaning the fly here. It's feces. This is why if you go to the zoo, you sometimes find chimpanzees eating their own feces, because evolution told them this is a great source of K2. You understand the problems of doing clinical trials with this. So finally, we reverted to K1, and we're just doing this trial funded by the European Renal Association. So we give 5 milligrams of K1 to dialysis patients during every dialysis session. And because we give so much K1, we have quite a dramatic increase in K2 because of the endogenous conversion. And our undercarboxylated MGP levels go down to almost 0. And hopefully in 1 to 2 years, I can tell you whether this does something to aortic calcification in these patients. But before we even know that, I believe the knowledge that we have today has an immediate implication. Oh, here's a Polish study which tried to study this. But again, maybe not powered, because GFR was still 20. They gave 90 micrograms of K2, and they found very little effect. Interestingly, in some patients, calcification decreased. But what they found is an effect on intima media thickness. So maybe it was a little too early to look after 9 months. So intermedia thickness increased to a lesser degree if you gave K2. We've already done and finished a proof of concept studies led by Vincent Brandenburg from our cardiology division. Again, this is not CKD patients. Patients had some degree of renal impairment, but not much. But Vincent Brandenburg looked at aortic valve calcification, and the take-home message was if you give 2 milligrams of K1 per day for 1 year or placebo, this is what happens. The undercarboxylated MGP decreases markedly in the K1 group as opposed to placebo. Calcification volume increases but much less than in the placebo. Peak flow decreases, increases here, and the valvular gradient stays. So this has led to a larger study being started right now, but maybe it even works if you are not a dialysis patient. I think the immediate implication, and at least for me, is that I have become very hesitant in giving warfarin to my dialysis patients. There's no question if you have a mechanical valve or pulmonary embolism, then you probably need warfarin. The NOACs are unproven, only apixaban is licensed for use, and we don't have any safety long-term data. So I think this is still a domain of warfarin. I'm always happy when my patient has falls, is frail, is elderly, and there's absolutely no question you can't give warfarin to this patient. But if you look at a pro-con debate of should I give warfarin if my patient has atrial fibrillation, there may be a risk of lower risk of ischemic stroke. And I'm stressing the may, because it's not proven. Epidemiologic studies don't show this. There certainly is an increased bleeding risk. There's a dramatically increased risk of boost-ring calcification, and there's a 10-fold higher risk of cancerphylaxis. So my take-home message is I don't do it. And I'm happy to fight with every cardiologist everywhere about this. You know, they come to you and pull out their CHATS-VAS score and say, you must do this. And I tell them, why? Show me. And remember, it's rat poison. So what did I say? I told you that vitamin K and MGP are major inhibitor system of calcification. CKD patients have a low intake and may have a reduced recycling, which makes them particularly vulnerable. Low vitamin K predicts calcification and survival. Vitamin K intervention is easy and safe. There's no known human toxicity. You give milligrams and buckets to pregnant women, nothing happens. Whether it's effective, we don't know. This is why we do the VitaVasc study. I avoid vitamin K antagonism in patients with advanced CKD, in particular dialysis. There may be benefits of giving warfarin right until dialysis, but not in dialysis. It's unproven. And that was my lecture. Thank you for listening.